Yay.
If I sound a little slurry tonight, I have a mouthful of sores, and so it hurts to talk. So just be patient. But what we're studying tonight is so good. It's so good. I've reviewed these notes several times, and every time I just get blown away.
Sorry, that was Dorothy.
That's right. We can live with those kind of things. So last time, been 2 weeks ago, we continued our study in how Jesus Christ is superior to angels in Hebrews chapter 2. We talked about how Jesus humbled himself from being God to come to earth to save us. Jesus was sitting at the right hand of God. He was the creator of everything, including angels, by the way. The angels served him. He was at the very top, yet he gave all that up for us. Then we talked about the idea that suffering was necessary for our salvation. We talked about God's attributes and how they impacted the mode of our salvation. And then I had this quote that I kind of made up myself, but I think it works. Only God can satisfy the demands of God. God's holiness had to be satisfied. So God's perfect love and mercy led God to sacrifice himself so that we could have salvation from the penalty of sin. The author of Hebrews used the theme that Jesus is superior to angels to teach us about God, about himself, about much of our time last week was spent describing God. And this continues through the last part of chapter 2 of Hebrews. We're going to pick up today in verse 11, and we're going to go through verse 18. And it's in the middle of the passage entitled, Jesus, the founder of our salvation. So we're going to look at verses 11 to 18. And if someone would just be willing to read that.
Both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all of one, for which reason I moved on verse 10. Okay. For what reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will sing praise to you. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, here am I and the children whom God has given me. Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of the flesh and blood, he himself likewise shares in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. For indeed he does not give aid to angels, but he does give aid to the seed of Abraham. Therefore, in all things he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted.
Okay.
Well, as we read that, you notice there is a lot of meat in these verses. There's a lot we can talk about, and we are going to talk about it. And I'm going to go kind of verse by verse through this. Verse 11 says, He who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source, or all of one. What does this mean? The Greek literally means all are of one. We all originate in God as the creator. God is the one who had to sacrifice himself to sanctify us, meaning to make us holy like himself. None of us could ever be holy enough to meet God's standard. What does it say in Isaiah 46:6? It says that our righteousness is like filthy rags or polluted garments.
That's Isaiah 64. You said 46.
Oh, 64, I'm sorry. Isaiah 64:6. And then Romans 3:10 says, none is righteous, no, not one. I know who I am. I clearly know who I am, and I know I'm not righteous. It's sad. Our salvation has to be of God. Anything short of God's righteousness is not good enough to satisfy God's demand for perfect justice and holiness. So Romans 3:4-3 quotes Genesis 15:6, Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. When we put our trust in God, God covers us with his righteousness. It's like a coat he puts around us.
Mm-hmm.
And so when God looks at us, he sees Jesus, who is perfect. So when he looks at us, he sees Jesus' righteousness, not my righteousness.
Right.
So God makes us holy so that we can meet his standard. That's how our sanctification has one source. It's God. Some of you remember we at CBC some time ago, we in our group, we saw this video called
The Good-O-Meter.
The Good-O-Meter. Do you remember that, Kathy?
Yes, I remember that very well.
It's on YouTube. You can look it up, Good-O-Meter. Look it up. It's a really poor video, quality video, but it is so well done. It shows these people going to heaven and they have to step on the Good-O-Meter. And it always goes bad. No matter what they did. Well, I tried to help other people.
I gave money.
I
didn't steal anything.
They had all these excuses. And then this one guy comes up and his folder is just full of these red sheets. And he's hanging his head. He knows he's been bad. And a man comes up and takes his folder and gives him a substitute folder. And the man that comes up has got the thing on that he's Jesus.
Says no, that's not fair. They say that's not fair. It's not why is he righteous? It's not him. It's him, and they point to Jesus. It's not the man's righteousness. He had none. It was Jesus's righteousness, and he went to the other side.
So no, what happened was step on the thing, and the man was going to step on it. Said no, he's going to do it,
Yeah.
and Jesus steps on it. And of course, it goes all the way to good, because he's perfect. And I just thought that's so poignant to say. It's not anything I do. He did it already. And that's what the writer to Hebrews is telling us right there. God did it all for us. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And next piece of this passage that I found was wonderful was it says, he is not ashamed to call them brothers. Wow. When Jesus made a way for us to be adopted into God's family. When we put our trust in Jesus, we literally become brothers and sisters of Jesus. Do you understand what that means? It blows me away every time I think about it. I was reading this morning in church. I review my notes before the praise team is practicing. And I read this and I thought, wow. In a family, often brothers and sisters do things that cause each other to be ashamed. I know it has happened in my family.
Not ours.
Never.
That must just be yours, Gary. It couldn't be
Yeah.
ours either.
But Jesus will never be ashamed of us. That's pretty strong words. Jesus will never be ashamed of us because we're covered by his righteousness. It all fits together. It's all a big whole right here.
Oh, on the first.
If he didn't, if I didn't have his righteousness, he'd be ashamed of me every single day. I know who I am. But that's not where we are. We're covered by Jesus' righteousness. He's not ashamed of it ever. Isn't that a blessing?
That is a blessing. It's also kind of runs a parallel. You may be going to say this in a minute, I don't know, but in Hebrews 11:16, it talks about, that's the chapter by faith, all these people did.
Right.
And then it talks about because of their longing for heaven, God is not ashamed to be called their God, type of thing. So, I mean, and for he has prepared a city for them. So God he can't be ashamed. I mean, he's
Done it all. How can he can't be ashamed? It's all about him. And every person is important to God. There are two passages that say this. 2 Peter 3:9, which says, God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. It's the one I keep quoting. But it also the Apostle Paul said the same thing in 1 Timothy 2:4. I just read that in my read through the Bible thing that we do. And we just read that, and I said, wait a minute, there it is again. I highlighted it. What a great verse. God does not want any person to have to be judged for his or her sin. His desire is that all should come to repentance and salvation. After all, God sacrificed himself to pay for our salvation. It was an expensive thing to do. Costly and pain and everything else. So what does it mean to be adopted into a family? Are any of you adopted? Were any of you adopted as children? Or born into?
Our grandson will be adopted, and it means being just like the rest.
That's right. My sister and her husband adopted two children, Tess and Sophia. And they don't look like them, obviously. They are dark skinned. Sophia she's a certified Indian. She's at the University of Alaska swimming and winning all kinds of races. She's quite a thing. And both Sophia and Tess have put their trust in Jesus. But they're adopted. They're part of the family. We just treat them as part of the family.
Oh, yeah.
They're secure in their position. And Tessa's story is just amazing. Tessa's birth mother was going to have an abortion. She went to a crisis pregnancy center and had an ultrasound, but then she was still determined to have the abortion, but she was in the stirrups. She was ready to have the abortion. But moments before she was waiting for them to come in. She got up,
ran out the door
and carried Tess to full term. So now Tess is living in a Christian home, freely testifies that she has faith in Jesus Christ. What a blessing. But she's ever been a part of it. We are part of this family of God. We are brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ. Can you believe that?
Yeah, but God takes it one more step. He doesn't adopt you as one of the children. He adopts you as a firstborn, which
Gives you all the rights
Yeah.
of inheritance.
it's a step above what we do.
Yes, it is. Absolutely, Gary. You just hit the nail on the head. So it's an amazing thing. And it's amazing that God wants such a big family.
He died, it said he died for the world, not just people that look like us or the people that live on the west, in the west or the east or the south or the wherever. He died for the world.
Yeah. And then this verse, it keeps going. That's exactly where the writer of Hebrews goes. He says, since therefore the children share in flesh and blood. We all look different. We all, most of us, many of us have different skin colors, different eye color, different hair. Some of us don't have hair. Some of us do have hair. And
I can reflect on that thought.
but really, we're more than 90% the same. More than that, on a cellular level, we are the same.
It's like 98 or 99%.
We all live because we have a heart that beats steadily and pumps blood throughout our bodies, stop the blood flow when we die. But really, on the cellular level, when you study it, we're all the same. Jesus became a human being just like us. He took on flesh and blood, our flesh, our blood. He had a heart that pumped blood throughout his body, just like we do.
Yeah.
He had to eat, he had to sleep, he had emotions, he laughed, he cried, he became angry, he was sad, he had vision and hearing like us. He used his hands as a carpenter. He was probably a pretty good carpenter.
And he was tempted like us too.
Yes.
Exactly. Yet, without sin.
Without sin, he never
He
did
never succumbed to
whatever the temptation was.
Yeah.
There's your difference.
All the types of things we experience as human beings, Jesus experienced, including the temptation to sin. And I believe Jesus' temptation was probably even stronger than anything we'll face, because it says in 1 Corinthians 10:13 that we'll never be tempted beyond what we can bear. Jesus' ability to withstand a temptation was much greater than ours, so his temptation would have been more severe, and temptation is severe. It can cause pain. It's really tough.
Mhm.
Emotional pain and physical pain. But because Jesus became flesh and blood, he was able to pay the penalty for our sin. He could die in our place. That's pretty strong.
Truly.
When Jesus died, he destroyed Satan. In verse 14, it says, he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil.
Quiet.
Satan had dominion over physical death. This was a dominion that was allowed by God. I don't understand it, but it was something that God allowed. When Jesus died, he destroyed Satan's dominion over death. And the Greek word that was translated destroyed literally means to render inoperative. How do you do this? Jesus' death on the cross was different than anybody else that ever lived. He died on his own timetable. None of us can do that except
That's
committing suicide. That's not the same thing. Jesus, in Matthew 27:50, it says, and Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. In Luke 23:46-47, it says, then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. Now then, when the centurion saw that what had taken place, he praised God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. Jesus' death was so different from others who were ever crucified. The Roman centurion recognized that Jesus was different. Jesus was able to release his spirit from his body on his own timetable.
yeah, we can't.
He had mastery. He was the master He had mastery over sin. And when Jesus died, I believe that he went to Sheol, the place of the dead. Ephesians 4:9 says, in saying he ascended, what does it mean? But that he also descended into the lower regions of the earth. But he didn't stay there, obviously. God resurrected him. But when Jesus left Sheol, he didn't leave alone. All of the Old Testament believers went with him to heaven because he had paid the price for their sin.
And what they were looking forward to, what we look back at, they were looking forward to.
Right.
And so he showed up and, okay,
Then they could be in heaven with God.
let's go.
Jesus became the righteousness they needed to be able to be with God. It's a beautiful thing. But Jesus destroyed Satan, defeated him, but the defeat is not totally complete because Satan hasn't been judged yet. God has allowed Satan to continue to have dominion on the earth. The current king of this world is Satan, and he's a horrible king because his desire is for people to suffer as much as possible. Satan continues fighting against God, but when God decides it's time, Jesus will very quickly come and completely defeat Satan and put him in prison for 1,000 years. Then after that, Satan will be released for a short period of time, and then he'll be thrown in the lake of fire for eternity. Satan's defeat is really done. It just hasn't happened yet. And then it goes on to say in verse 15 that Jesus' death delivered us from slavery. And it says, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. The slavery is to Satan. Satan is the most fearsome slave master. And it says it's lifelong. That's pretty horrible. Jesus paid the price to deliver us from this slavery. When we put our trust in him, we're delivered. It's a beautiful thing.
My chains fell off.
And he goes on to say, the writer to Hebrews in verse 16, it says, for surely it is not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. In order to free mankind from slavery, Jesus had to become a man in every respect. We've already talked about that at length. But not only did Jesus become a man, he became a Jewish man. That was the only way he could be a high priest and the Messiah and the king. Verse 17 says that Jesus became a merciful and faithful high priest. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God. Someone who is merciful is very caring. He has sympathy for and cares for others, even if the others don't deserve it. That is godly mercy. I tell you, I don't deserve the mercy that God gives me. None of us do. Someone who is faithful can be trusted, and Jesus is totally faithful. You know what? None of us deserve that kind of faithfulness either. But he gives it to us freely because he loves us. And he calls us brothers. He's not ashamed to call us brothers. And I cling to that verse. That's such a beautiful verse. He's not ashamed to call us brothers. And then he goes on in verse 17, he says, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. Propitiation is a theological word that means that Jesus satisfied the demands of a righteous God so that God was able to pardon our sins and declare us to be not guilty. Another way of putting it is that God stamped the debt of our sin as paid in full. Another very beautiful thing. And finally, Jesus can help us when we're tempted because he knows what we're going through. In verse 18, it says, for because he himself has suffered from when tempted, he was able to help those who are being tempted. I like what it says. He himself has suffered when tempted. Temptation is not fun. It's terrible. It's difficult. And because resisting it is so hard and can be very painful. And when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, he fasted for 40 days. You know that wouldn't have been any fun. That's painful. That's tough.
We would have died.
Yeah, we would have died. Jesus knows what we're going through. Therefore, he can help us when we're tempted. This should be a very comfort to us. I was just thinking just now about when Joseph was tempted by Potiphar's wife. That was painful for him. He ran to avoid that falling into temptation. Succumbing to the temptation, he ran and left his coat behind. And it didn't turn out very pleasant for him. He ended up in prison
3 years.
for 3 years. So temptation is hard, but Jesus knows what we're going through because he's been there. So when we're in those situations and we can pray to him and say, Jesus, you know what I'm going through. Please help me. And he does. And he's sitting at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us and making intercession for us every moment of every day.
I just thought about the picture of his suffering, what he went through, and we have a picture of that, and to realize that none of us have suffered like that. None of us,
No.
nor could we. But because he suffered so much, that he can help us through our suffering. He does understand.
He
So
doesn't.
what we experience in suffering is nothing compared to what he suffered. He gave up heaven.
But not only that, I mean, it's not just the physical suffering, he bore the sins of the world, past and present, and
Everything.
future.
Yeah.
I mean, he had never felt sin before, until that point.
And he took it all.
That had to be
And so
horrible.
that had to
Every
have been the
drop-
worst. That's probably that was probably the worst part of it for him.
Oh, it was,
The
yeah.
most difficult part, not the worst. Most
The
difficult.
lady that founded Bible Study Fellowship, Miss Johnson, Weather Johnson,
Mhm.
she said she was in China before World War II. She was missionary there. And she said, of course, there's huge crowds of people. And she said, a person came up to her that was a leper. And she said, Jesus touched the leper. So she says, I wanted to be like Jesus. So she said she took the person's hand to give them a coin or something because they were begging. And she said the revulsion that she felt because the hand, of course, there was no treatment back then. And it was all just, rotting off and the fingers falling off and stuff like that. She goes, it was disgusting. And she said she just felt a revulsion go through her body, but she wanted to show love to this person. And she said, how must Christ have felt to feel the revulsion of all the sin of the world? She goes, I know what I felt with just holding a diseased hand. What must he have felt to touch the filthiness of the sin of the world? She said, that's what he suffered.
And then you think that, when he goes, Father, why have you forsaken me? I mean, he'd been with God the Father, eternity past. I mean, we
Right.
can't even comprehend that. And then all of a sudden that relationship was broken because of the sin. It was, I just can't imagine. None of us can imagine.
Yeah, and we couldn't bear it. That's why it went dark when he was
Wow.
doing that.
Mhm.
Yeah. What a beautiful picture this is. So that ostensibly the writer of Hebrews saying that Jesus is superior to angels, but the whole focus is on Jesus. Not on angels, it's on Jesus and what he's done for us. And by doing that, he's revealing to us God himself. Because Jesus and God are one. Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. This is God. This is who God is. He's willing to go through all that to save us therefore we should be valuing, we should have a deep sense of value for what we have in Jesus.
And if he went through the one thing he didn't have to was his separation from God, so that we don't have to.
Right. He was separated from God for some time, 2.5 days or whatever it was, separated from God for a period of time. So exactly what you said, Karen, so that we don't ever have to.
This is why it's called a substitutionary death. It's not a human sacrifice. It's a substitutionary death.
So when we put our trust in him, we don't ever have to be separated from God ever again. We never will be. And I was telling my grandsons a Bible story this week, and we got into talking about this, and I said, because you've trusted Jesus, no one, nothing can tear you away from him. Nobody can pull you out of his hand. Nobody can snatch you out of his hand. We are secure in him.
Our salvation can't be lost.
No. Nothing
Truly
can,
saved.
nothing can separate us from Jesus.
Yeah, things that are great from Romans 8.
It's a beautiful thing. And I just love the way the writer of Hebrews just hammers in on this. And many of us have heard this before, but it's good to study it again and again and again, because it hammers it into our brains and we get it. And every time I read this, I get something new out of it. There's some new way of looking at what God has done for us, what Jesus did for us.
Just remind us yet again. Just remind us.
And knowing the depth of his sacrifice makes me want to honor him all the more.
So that the veil was torn, that we never have to be separated.
That's right. That's one of the most important things that happened when Jesus died, was God tore the veil. And the veil in the temple was like 30 feet tall or something.
No, it was 60 feet tall.
18 inches thick.
And
Yeah.
I was going to say the thickness was,
18 inches.
18 inches or something like that, of layers and layers of fabric.
But it was the height of the temple was 60 feet.
Yeah.
And I could just see God taking his finger and going,
Open that up.
the price has been paid. And so this is just a beautiful thing. And I know I'm kind of dwelling a little bit on this, but it's important. It's so important. It's the foundation of our faith.
Yeah.
I'm kind of at my summary, and I'm not going to even read the summary. You have it there. But next week, we're going to look at Hebrews 3 and the first 6 verses of Hebrews 3, how Jesus was superior to Moses. And so that's, if you want to read ahead, that's what we're going to look at. First five or six verses of Hebrews 3. Anybody have any more comments or questions on this?
wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
Wow.
Wow, indeed.
I'm going to stop the recording.